From the Civil War until the First World War, the United States was viewed as being in a relative state of peace, with a great expansion in both industrial and economical development that paved the way to the future. However, one event during that so-called time of peace propelled the United States from the relatively isolated position to the first real assertion of global influence, the Spanish-American War. Now, before going into the war, we need some background info on this conflict. A lot of information leads to this, so my coverage will be rather brief. American interests in Cuba had been brewing for many years. Many Southern politicians saw Cuba as a natural expansion for slavery, having to either be purchased or forcibly annexed from the ever-weakening Spanish Empire. During the early 1850s, Louisianan Senator Pierre Soule came to be the main voice in attempting to get Cuba into the United States, pushing for it on the floor of Congress. During his time as Minister of Spain, he drafted the Osen Manifesto, calling for the purchase of Cuba or war with Spain if they refused. Many Southern slaveholders feared that if rebellion was to start in Cuba, that it would spark slave rebellions all across the US as well, and the US would need to intervene in the island to prevent that from happening. When the manifesto was released, it sparked heavy outrage from Northerners and Europe. The Pierce administration was heavily damaged from this, and the idea of annexing Cuba wouldn't come up for another 40 years. Looking at Cuba itself, sections of the islands were in open revolt starting in 1868, an event referred to as the 10 Years' War. I plan to do a fully detailed episode on the conflict sometime in the future, so I won't go into much detail here. The war was the most major rebellion in Cuba at this point, up until the War of Independence in the 1890s. Large landowners rose up against the Spanish, citing the harsh treatment and wealth inequality that existed on the island. After some large successes, the rebellion largely ended in 1878, but many of the graduates of this war would become central players 2 decades later, and the fever of rebellion was never put out amongst the people. Following this war, many changes occurred within Cuba. Slavery was outlawed in 1886, adding a massive influx of former slaves into the farming and urban workforce. Many of the wealthy plantation owners now saw a large amount of their wealth vanish, and corporations started to take a larger foothold on the island. Also, during this period of time saw a massive influx of American capital into Cuba, largely from the sugar, tobacco, and mining industries. This led many in the US government to start having a vested interest in Cuba once more, and the ideal of Manifest Destiny once again became an interest to many of the American public, seeing the alliance in Central America and the Caribbean as the most likely target. On February the 24th of 1895, Cuban activist Jose Marti launched off uprisings all around the island. He had been working to build up support, men, supplies, and weaponry for the Cubans for nearly 15 years at this point, garnering support for the Cubans all across the Americas. With the ability of a quick victory squashed, the rebellion turned towards guerrilla warfare once again. The Spanish responded by moving many Cubans into internment camps and reintroducing methods used during the 10 Years' War, executing all men above a certain age if they were outside at certain times, burning down villages, stealing supplies, etc., who drew massive criticism from the American government and the public. Many saw the Cuban struggle as much the same as the American Revolutionary War, and calls for the US to intervene in the war gained massive support as time went on. President McKinley sent the USS Maine to Havana to protect American citizens and interests. At 9:40 on the evening of February the 15th, the Maine sunk following a massive explosion in the harbor, which killed 260 out of 355 of the crew. The cause of the explosion isn't fully known to this day. It was originally stated that the powder meg was ignited from the outside, which was caused by the Spanish, but modern analysis and theories paint it as possible as being an internal explosion, so the true cause is not known. On April the 25th, the US declared that a state of war existed between them and Spain, with over 250,000 volunteers entering the army. In the Pacific Theater, the Battle of Manila Bay occurred on May the 1st, and the American fleet destroyed the Spanish with minimum casualties, blockading Manila while land troops arrived from the west coast. Ships from other major powers were stationed within the harbor. The Germans, with interests of their own, were eager to take advantage of whatever opportunities the conflict in the islands might afford. On August the 13th, the Spanish in the Philippines surrendered to the Americans, following the next day by the supposed mock Battle of Manila, where the Spanish let the Americans into the city to prevent it from being captured by the Filipino revolutionaries. And yes, I will be doing a video on the Filipino Revolution sometime in the future as well. In Cuba, the 5th Army Corps under General William R. Shafter landed at Vicuña and Siboney, east of Santiago, and established a base of operations. The Cubans by and large viewed the US involvement as the key to their independence, especially with the overwhelming public support in America for the Cuban cause. The Americans who had stuck with the Civil War-style movement in battle quickly changed to a Russian cover, which was already implemented by the Spanish. On July the 1st, a combined force of about 15,000, which included Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, attacked 1,300 entrenched Spaniards in dangerous Civil War-style frontal assaults at the Battle of Alicante and Battle of San Juan Hill. More than 200 were killed and close to 1,200 wounded in the fighting, thanks largely to the high rate of fire from the Spanish. After the battle, the American advance halted. Spanish troops had successfully defended Fort Canassa, which allowed them to stabilize their line and bar entry to Santiago. The Americans and Cubans began a bloody siege on the city on the same day that the Spanish Caribbean Squadron was wiped out. During the night, Cuban troops dug a series of trenches towards the Spanish position. Once completed, these trenches were occupied by US soldiers, and a new set of excavations went forward. The American artillery and Gatling guns fired daily into the city, with over 600 shells and 7,000 rounds of ammunition. After 2 weeks, the commanding Spanish general Jose Toral finally agreed to capitulate to the Americans, surrendering not only his garrison, but another 9,000 troops within the vicinity, which ended most military action in Cuba. The next landing encounter was in Puerto Rico, which American forces landed on July the 25th under General Nelson A. Miles. Miles fought largely skirmish-style battles during the 2 weeks of fighting, suffering only 48 casualties, of which 5 of them died, but failed to capture much in the way of significant territory. With defeats in Cuba and the Philippines, and both of its fleets destroyed, Spain sued for peace, and an armistice was called for on August the 12th. With the Treaty of Paris finally signed on December the 10th, ratified by the US Senate on February the 8th. The treaty had the United States gain the colonies of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, with Cuba becoming a US protectorate. Having been occupied since July the 17th the previous year, Cuba was under a military government, but formed its own civil government and gained independence on May the 20th of 1902. However, the US imposed various restrictions on the new government, including prohibiting alliance with other countries, and reserved the right to intervene in the country, as well as a perpetual lease on Guantanamo Bay. Directly after the end of the war against the Spanish, a revolt by the native Filipinos waged against the Americans for another 3 years, causing over 50 times the casualties the war against the Spanish cost. But that is a topic for another time.